खबरां दा लेखा जोखा जुलाई 30, 2025।
Prime Minister Carney cabinet to meet amid Palestine statehood talk, U.S. trade discussions. Prime Minister Mark Carney is meeting virtually with his cabinet today to discuss the state of trade negotiations with the U.S. and the situation in the Middle East. The trade talks escalate and as Canada's closest peers move toward recognizing a Palestinian state. Dominic Leiblanche, the minister responsible for Canada-US trade in Washington today, meeting with US officials. Carney said Monday that Canada's negotiations with the United States are in intense phase after President Donald Trump clinched a critical agreement with the European Union. Trump told reporters last week that Canada wasn't a priority ahead of his August 1st deadline to make trade deals. Ministers are also expected to discuss the situation in the Middle East. Carney spoke Tuesday with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer after Starmer said the UK would officially recognize a Palestinian state if Israel does not implement a ceasefire and drastically scale up aid in Gaza, where numerous humanitarian groups say starvation is taking place. Canada co-signed a statement with allied countries Tuesday to express the willingness of our countries to recognize the state of Palestine as an essential step toward the two-state solution and invite all countries that have not done so to join this call. The statement included France, Australia, and New Zealand. France announced last week it will recognize a Palestinian state. The statement came out after a major conference at the United Nations on the two-state solution, which Israel and the US boycotted. Jewish advocacy group B'nai B'rith Canada criticized Canada's stance at that conference, which it said promoted a one-side narrative that excused terrorism, legitimized authoritarian regimes, and obstructed any serious path to peace. The group said remarks about Israeli policies driving violence by Palestinians were inappropriate, and Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand's comments about the conflict being rooted in dwelling narratives were deeply troubling. Advocates for a Palestinian state say Israel is trying to block all routes to self-determination, noting that Israeli cabinet ministers have talked openly of ethnically cleansing the territories that Israel occupies. We are failing the test set by us to prevent mass humanitarian tragedies, Liberal MP Will Grieve said Sunday in a video posted on social media in which he endorsed Palestinian statehood. Crimes against civilians, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and acts of genocide are never justified, nor in criminal impunity for the leaders who order or permit such acts to occur. Canada has said it wants the Palestinian Authority to govern both the West Bank and Gaza, but only after the organization undertakes deep reforms. The Palestinian Authority is widely accused of corruption and hasn't held elections since 2006. Ottawa pledged $10 million this week to accelerate reform and capacity building for the Palestinian Authority.
प्रधानमंत्री मार्क करनी अज अपनी कैबिनेट ਨੂੰ ਮਿਲਣਗੇ, ਜਿਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੋ ਮੁੱਦੇ ਨੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਤੇ ਵਿਚਾਰ ਵਟਾਂਦਰੇ ਹੋਣਗੇ। ਇੱਕ ਤਾਂ ਗੁਆਂਢੀ ਮੁਲਕ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਚੱਲ ਰਹੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਟ੍ਰੇਡ ਟਾਕ ਆ ਉਹ, ਔਰ ਦੂਸਰੀ ਹੈ ਜੀ ਫਲਸਤੀਨ ਵਾਲਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਮਸਲਾ, ਉਸ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਹੋਏਗੀ। याद रहे पिछले हफ्ते खास तौर दे उत्ते राष्ट्रपति डोनाल्ड ट्रंप ने आख दिता सी कि कनेडा दे नाल वपारक संधि है जिहड़ी ਉਹ ਸਾਡੀ ਪ੍ਰਮੁੱਖਤਾ ਤੌਰ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਇਸ ਵਕਤ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈ। 1 ਅਗਸਤ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਡੈਡਲਾਈਨ ਆ ਉਸ ਨੂੰ ਨਾ ਵਧਾਉਣ ਦੀ ਵੀ ਗੱਲ ਹੈ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਆਈ ਸੀ, ਔਰ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਮੁਤਲਕ ਪ੍ਰਧਾਨ ਮੰਤਰੀ ਅੱਜ ਆਪਣੀ ਕੈਬਨਿਟ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਨਗੇ। ਫਲਸਤੀਨ ਦੇ ਮਸਲੇ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਗੱਲ ਚੱਲਦੀ ਆ ਉੱਥੇ ਕੁਝ ਕੁ ਮੁਲਕਾਂ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਿ ਫਲਸਤੀਨ ਨੂੰ अलग अपनी स्टेट के तौर के उत्ते मानता देने की गल है जी कर ली है, और याद रहे इस दे मतलब कैनेडा की भी हामी भरी गई, और इस तो पहला पिछले हफ्ते फ्रांस ने भी इसनूं मानता दे दी सी, ते नाल दी नाल इस गल का भी हवाला किया गया कि वो मुल्क जिन्हां ने इस चीज़ के उत्ते इस नुकते नज़र के उत्ते अपनी जिहड़ी हाँ जां ना नहीं प्रगटाई, उन्होंने जरूर इस दे विच शमूल होना चाहिए। याद रहे गाजा विखे खास तौर के उत्ते चल रहे जिहड़े हालात ने उन्हां दे विच तकरीबन $10 मिलियन दा जिहड़ी हादी है कैनेडा सरकार ने होर भरी है, और फलस्तीन दे विच मनुखी ਜਿਹੜੇ ਲੋਕ ਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਘਾਣ ਭੁੱਖਮਰੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਹੈ ਤੇ ਉਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਬਿਮਾਰੀ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਦੇ ਮਰਨ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਗੱਲ ਦਾ ਪ੍ਰਗਟਾਵਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਵੱਡੀ ਪੱਧਰ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਹੋ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਕਿਸ ਪ੍ਰਕਾਰ ਅੱਜ ਦੇ ਯੁੱਗ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਮਨੁੱਖਤਾ ਨੂੰ ਨਸਲ, ਰੰਗ ਤੇ ਧਾਰਨਾ ਦੇ ਆਧਾਰ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਨਸਲਕੁਸ਼ੀ ਹੈ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉਹ ਕਿਸੇ ਵੀ ਹਾਲਤ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਬਰਦਾਸ਼ਤ ਨਹੀਂ ਕੀਤੀ ਜਾਣੀ ਚਾਹੀਦੀ।
With Ottawa promising bail reform, what's driving the debate? Premiers are putting pressure on Ottawa to implement tougher bail rules, with the federal government expected to table bail reform legislation in the fall. Critics are expressing worries already about Ottawa's plan. So what's driving the debate on bail reform? During the spring's federal election, the Liberals promised to move aggressively to implement stricter bail laws by introducing a reverse onus for a number of offences. A reverse onus moves the burden of proof from the prosecutor to the accused, meaning they would have to justify being granted bail. The criminal code already has a reverse onus for bail in place for many serious offences, including murder. The Liberal would add new offences to the list, including car thefts involving violence or those conducted for a criminal organization, and home invasions and some human trafficking and smuggling offences. Justice Minister Sean Fraser told the Canadian press he plans to bring forward a crime bill in the fall. It's not clear what will be in it. Fraser said the government will consider including additional reforms, but at minimum, it will implement the crime policies the Liberals promised during the election. Yes, through amendments to the Criminal Code in 2023, they expanded reverse onus bail provisions to include more firearms and weapon offences and more crimes involving intimate partner violence. In 2019, the government established a reverse onus for those charged with a violent offence involving an intimate partner if they have a prior conviction for a similar offence. The 2023 amendments followed calls from provincial premiers and police chiefs for the federal government to bring in stricter bail rules for report violent offenders. It followed some high-profile cases, including that of Ontario Provincial Police Constable Greg Perzachala, who was killed while responding to a vehicle in a ditch. In 2024, Ontario Police Associations called for further reform, saying there are many cases of accused persons but on bail who are re-arrested shortly after being granted bail, including some that don't make the news. They said the public expects that in the name of public safety, violent repeat offenders will not be released on bail unless there is a compelling reason and a sensible plan to ensure that they are not at risk in re-offending while awaiting trial. Premier said earlier this month they expect the federal government to follow through with its promised reforms. At a press conference following Premier's meeting in Huntsville, Ontario last week, Ontario Premier Doug Ford said the provincial leaders talked about the need for real bail reform that keeps criminals behind bars and keep our communities safe. He said the premiers would be holding Prime Minister Mark Carney's accountable for delivering full-fledged and not half-baked reform. Ford said he'd love to see mandatory sentencing, so when someone breaks into your home, puts a gun to your head, terrorizes your neighborhood, that person doesn't get out on bail after being out on bail 5 times. The federal government is responsible for setting bail laws under the criminal code, but provincial and territorial governments prosecute most criminal offences, conduct bail hearings, and enforce bail conditions. A spokesperson for Fraser said the federal government is working with provinces and territories to reform bail and sentencing with a focus on repeat violent offenders. This was a key topic at the recent First Minister's meeting, and Minister Fraser has made it a top priority. The Conservative Party has long campaigned on a promise of jail, not bail, and accused the Liberals of being soft on crime and implementing catch and release policies. During the recent federal election, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre campaigned heavily on crime and said he would prohibit those convicted of 3 serious offences from getting bail. Anthony Du, professor Emeritus at the University of Toronto Centre for Criminology and Sociology studies said calls to toughen a bail law are based on the false assumption that large numbers of dangerous people are being released. Of course, the ones we hear about in particular are the ones who committed a serious and a violent offense, he said. So we are hearing about those cases, but the assumption that we have a lenient system is questioned by the fact that 80% of our prisoners in Ontario in the provincial prisons are now awaiting trial. Calls to make bail tougher to get are bad policy but easy politics, he argued, because politicians can always point to someone who committed a crime while on bail. If you're going to be detaining another 100 people or a few hundred people in order to reduce the likelihood that one person is going to commit another offense, I think we should be a little bit cautious, he said. Shakir Rahim, director for the Criminal Justice Program at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, said that approximately 70% of those in provincial remand centres are waiting for trial, up from about 20% in 1982. The consequences of tougher bail rules is that they erode what is a core safeguard of liberty for the innocent, he said. In an environment where we have record levels of bail being denied and we have further erosions, whether through reverse onus provisions or otherwise, we really dilute the strength of that protection. Rahim said there is a trend towards immediately viewing people who have been arrested as guilty of it or talked about in that way, even though only half of cases in Canada result in criminal convictions. The more people that you deny bail to, it is a foreseen consequences that some of those people will have been factually innocent, he said. Rahim said provincial jails are overcrowded with conditions that include 23-hour-a-day lockdowns and a lack of medical care. When you take people and you deny them bail, it can be up to 30 months before they have their day in court, he said. So one of the issues that we are concerned about is people feeling the pressure to plead guilty to certain offenses just to get out of the terrible condition that they are subject to. Catherine Latimer, Executive Director of the John Howard Society of Canada, said pre-trial detention rates are way too high. That is the canary in the coal mine to suggest your system is really seriously flawed. It's not enough to think that the answer is to put more people in there by using more reverse onus provisions. Latimer said we haven't been analyzed whether the last set of reverse onus provisions have done anything. In 2023, when the federal government introduced the previous bail reform legislation, then Justice Minister Arif Virani called the provinces and territories to collect better data on bail and share that with the federal government. Rahim said we don't have any data about the number of people who re-offend while out on bail or whether they are ultimately found guilty. So how can we know about the state of the bail system? About whether reverse onuses or other policy changes work without this information.
ਸੂਬਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਮੁਖੀ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਨੇ ਉਹ ਖਾਸ ਤੌਰ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਇਕੱਤਰਤਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਕੱਠੇ ਹੋਏ ਨੇ, ਜਿਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਿ ਉਹ ਫੈਡਰਲ ਸਰਕਾਰ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਦਬਾਅ ਬਣਾ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਬੇਲ ਸਿਸਟਮ ਹੈ ਉਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਛੇਤੀ ਤੋਂ ਛੇਤੀ ਸੋਧ ਲਿਆਂਦੀ ਜਾਵੇ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਪਤਝੜ ਦੀ ਰੁੱਤ ਦੇ ਸੈਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਮੰਨਣਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਇਸ ਨੁਕਤੇ ਨਜ਼ਰ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਬਿਹਤਰ ਕਾਰਗੁਜ਼ਾਰੀ ਕੀਤੀ ਜਾਵੇ, ਕਾਨੂੰਨੀ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਸੋਧਾਂ ਨੇ ਉਹ ਕੀਤੀਆਂ ਜਾਣ ਤਾਂ ਕਿ ਉਹ ਵਿਅਕਤੀ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕਿ ਬਾਰ-ਬਾਰ ਹਿੰਸਕ ਵਾਰਦਾਤਾਂ ਕਰਦੇ ਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਬੇਲ ਨਾ ਹੋ ਸਕੇ। ਔਰ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਭਾਵੇਂ ਆਸਮੰਦ ਨੇ, ਪਰ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸਲਾਹਕਾਰ ਨੇ ਜਾਂ ਕਹਿ ਸਕਦੇ ਆ ਕਿ ਰਿਸਰਚਰਸ ਨੇ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਕਿ ਵਾਕਈ ਕਿ ਇਸ ਪ੍ਰਕਾਰ ਦਾ ਕੋਈ ਡਾਟਾ ਹੈ ਜਿਸ ਦੇ ਆਧਾਰ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਫੈਸਲੇ ਨੇ ਕਾਨੂੰਨਨ ਤੌਰ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਬਦਲਾਵ ਲਿਆਂਦੇ ਜਾਣ। ਯਾਦ ਰਹੇ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਲਿਬਰਲ ਪਾਰਟੀ ਦੀ ਸਰਕਾਰ ਹੈ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ 2019 ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਪਣੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਇੰਟੀਮੇਟ ਪਾਰਟਨਰ ਦੇ ਵਾਇਲੈਂਸ ਦੇ ਸੰਬੰਧ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੁਝ ਤਰਤੀਬਾਂ ਲਿਆਂਦੀਆਂ ਸਨ ਬੇਲਿੰਗ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਔਰ ਬੇਲ ਦੇ ਮੁਤਲਕ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ 2023 ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਕੁਝ ਤਬਦੀਲੀਆਂ ਲਿਆਂਦੀਆਂ ਸਨ, ਪਰ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਖਤ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਤਬਦੀਲੀਆਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਮੰਗ ਆ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਅੰਟਰੀਓ ਦੇ ਮੁੱਖ ਮੰਤਰੀ ਨੇ ਉਸਨੇ ਵੀ ਬੜੇ ਸਖਤ ਲਫ਼ਜ਼ਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੀਤੀ ਹੈ। ਔਰ ਯਾਦ ਰਹੇ ਵਿਰੋਧੀ ਧਿਰ ਕੰਜ਼ਰਵੇਟਿਵ ਪਾਰਟੀ ਦੇ ਮੁਖੀ ਦਾ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਬੇਲ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਜੇਲ੍ਹ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਇਹ ਸਲੋਗਨ ਵੀ ਸਥਾਪਿਤ ਕੀਤਾ ਕਿ ਉਹ ਵਿਅਕਤੀ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਬਾਰ-ਬਾਰ ਹਿੰਸਕ ਵਾਰਦਾਤਾਂ ਕਰਦੇ ਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਬੇਲ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੋਣੀ ਚਾਹੀਦੀ, ਬਲਕਿ ਉਹ ਜੇਲ੍ਹ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੋਣੇ ਚਾਹੀਦੇ ਹਨ। ਬਾਕੀ ਜੇਲ੍ਹ ਅਧਿਕਾਰੀਆਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਅਧਿਕਾਰੀਆਂ ਨੇ ਵੀ ਇਸ ਗੱਲ ਦਾ ਸਪਸ਼ਟੀਕਰਨ ਕੀਤਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਸਾਡੇ ਪਾਸ ਕੋਈ ਐਸਾ ਡਾਟਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਜਿਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਹ ਅੰਕੜੇ ਦਰਜ ਹੋਣ ਜਿਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਿ ਕੋਈ ਵੀ ਵਿਅਕਤੀ ਵਾਰ-ਵਾਰ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਹਿੰਸਕ ਵਾਰਦਾਤਾਂ ਕਰਦਾ ਹੈ ਤਾਂ ਕਿ ਉਸ ਨੂੰ ਜੇਲ੍ਹ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਰੱਖਿਆ ਜਾ ਸਕੇ। ਪਰ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਦੋ ਕਈ ਸਵਾਲ ਹੋਰ ਵੀ ਖੜੇ ਹੋਏ ਕਿ ਜੇਲ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੀ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਰੱਖਣ ਦੇ ਲਈ ਪ੍ਰਵਿਧੀ ਹੈ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਘੱਟੋ ਘੱਟ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਤਾਂ 30 ਮਹੀਨੇ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਇੰਤਜ਼ਾਰ ਕਰਨਾ ਪੈ ਰਿਹਾ ਕਿਸੇ ਵੀ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੀ ਕੋਰਟ ਪ੍ਰੋਸੀਡਿੰਗ ਦੇ ਜੱਜ ਦੇ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਪੇਸ਼ ਹੋਣ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ।
Bank of Canada holds key rate at 2.75% as economy shows resilience to tariff. Signs of resilience in the Canadian economy were enough for the Bank of Canada to leave its benchmark interest rate unchanged Wednesday, but the specter of US trade uncertainty continues to cast a shadow over the central bank's decisions. The central bank's policy rate remains at 2.75% after a third consecutive hold. Governor Tiff Macklem said in prepared remarks that the Governing Council's decision came from a clear consensus. With a backdrop of considerable trade uncertainty, Canada's economy has yet to deteriorate sharply in the face of US tariffs, and underlying inflation is showing some stubbornness. The Bank of Canada lowers its policy rate when it wants to stimulate the economy, but keeps borrowing costs elevated when it's worried inflation will rise. Macklem said the economy is showing some resilience so far, but he also opened the door to lowering rates if growth slows more sharply. If a weakening economy puts further downward pressure on inflation and the upward price pressures from the trade disruptions are contained, there may be a need for a reduction in the policy interest rate, he said. CIBC senior economist Andrew Grantham said in a note to clients Wednesday morning that the Bank of Canada appears to be getting a little more comfortable with the idea that future rate cuts could be needed to support the economy. He said Macklem's language gave a hint that rate cuts could be on the table for September, but cautioned that upcoming economic data will have more sway. Though headline inflation rose 2 ticks to 1.9% in June, the Bank of Canada sees underlying inflation levels around 2.5% when stripping out volatility and tax changes that are skewing the data. Canada's labour market is showing some weakness in tariff-exposed sectors such as manufacturing, but other industries continue to broadly add jobs. Macklem said the Bank of Canada will be watching how much tariffs affect business activity and demand for Canadian exports, and whether higher costs from those import duties are passed on to customers. US executive tariff rates are less than that they were threatened, Macklem noted, but are still higher than recent historical experience. The odds of a severe and escalating global trade war have diminished in recent months, he said. While US President Donald Trump has recently struck trade deals with the likes of Japan and European Union, those agreements still come with some level of tariffs. Macklem said the nature of those deals suggests the United States is not returning to open trade. The Bank of Canada published a monetary policy report alongside its rate decision Wednesday, but that report once again did not include a single central forecast for the economy, as the central bank's outlook remains clouded by uncertainty. Instead, the bank offered a scenario based on the current tariff level persisting and two others that outline both de-escalation and further ramp up on tariffs. Each of those case studies sees at least some level of tariffs persisting. While it's tricky to get a firm number on what tariff levels look like, given a variety of exemptions and overlapping duties, the central bank sees the effective US tariff rate on Canada at roughly 7 or 8% today, up 5% points from the start of the year. The bank's monetary policy makers also assume a vast majority of Canadian goods will be exempt from tariffs over the coming years thanks to their compliance with the Canada-US-Mexico agreement as companies rush to get certified. In the status quo scenario, the Bank of Canada sees the economy rebounding through the rest of this year after an estimated decline of 1.5% in annualized real gross domestic product last quarter. The current tariff scenario has real GDP growth growth coming in 0.5 percentage points lower in 2025 and 2026 compared to the Bank of Canada's pre-trade war projections in January. Inflation would also hold around 2% through the end of 2027 in the outcome, as the forces pushing prices higher are roughly offset by the forces dampening down. A de-escalation scenario would cut US tariffs on Canada in half, putting less upward pressure on inflation and seeing growth rebound faster. Canada's counter tariffs are also waived in this example. But an escalation outcome would see the United States place a sweeping 10% tariff on all goods from Canada and Mexico, ignoring the current exemption of CUSMA compliance, in addition to a threatened 50% tariff on copper imports. Canada would then respond with a 25% tariff on $120 billion of US goods, up from the current tariff scenario of $60 billion. This escalated scenario would see inflation rise and the economy fall into a recession for the rest of 2025. Trump has threatened to impose a 35% duty on Canadian imports starting Friday if a trade deal isn't struck between the countries before then. The Bank of Canada's forecasts don't specifically address the impact of that possible outcome.
ਬੈਂਕ ਆਫ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਨੇ ਵਿਆਜ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਦਰ ਹੈ 2.75% ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਬਹਾਲ ਰੱਖੀ ਹੈ। ਉਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਿਸੇ ਪ੍ਰਕਾਰ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਤਬਦੀਲੀ ਹੈ ਉਹ ਨਹੀਂ ਕੀਤੀ। ਯਾਦ ਰਹੇ ਅਗਲੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਐਲਾਨਨਾਮੇ ਨੇ ਭਾਵੇਂ ਸੈਪਟੰਬਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੋਣੇ ਨੇ, ਪਰ ਇਹ ਜ਼ਰੂਰ ਕਲੀਅਰ ਕਰ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਗਿਆ ਕਿ ਮੌਜੂਦਾ ਸਮਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕੰਟਰੈਕਸ਼ਨ ਹੈ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਦੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਖਰਚੇ ਕਰਨ ਦੀ, ਉਹ ਇੱਕ ਬਹੁਤ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਵੱਡਾ ਕਾਰਨ ਹੈ। ਟੈਰਿਫ ਦੇ ਮਸਲੇ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਵੀ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਕੀ ਪ੍ਰਭਾਵ ਪੈਣਗੇ, ਇਸ ਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਤਾਂ ਜੇ ਕੁਝ ਨਹੀਂ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਆਇਆ, ਪਰ ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਬਹਾਲ ਕੀਤੀ ਗਈ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਆਉਣ ਵਾਲੇ ਸਮੇਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਅਗਰ ਮਹਿੰਗਾਈ ਦੀ ਦਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵਾਧਾ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਹੈ ਤਾਂ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਵਿਆਜ ਦਰ ਹੈ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਸੈਪਟੰਬਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸ਼ਾਇਦ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਫਰਕ ਆ ਜ਼ਰੂਰ ਪਏ। ਕੁਝ ਕੁ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਦਾ ਮਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਇਹ ਵੀ ਮੰਨਣਾ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਸ਼ਾਇਦ ਇਸ ਵਾਰੀ ਵੀ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਟੈਰਿਫ ਆ ਉਸ ਦੇ ਮਾਫ ਕਰਨਾ ਇਸ ਵਾਰ ਵੀ ਵਿਆਜ ਦਰ ਹੈ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਉਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਦਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕਟੌਤੀ ਆ ਉਹ ਸ਼ਾਇਦ ਇੱਕ ਜਵਾਨੀ ਦੀ ਕੀਤੀ ਜਾਵੇ, ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕਿ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੋਈ। ਔਰ ਇਹ ਪਿਛਲੇ ਸਮੇਂ ਤੋਂ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਇੱਕ ਵੱਡੀ ਮਾਤਰਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਖਾਸ ਤੌਰ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਨਿਗਾਹ ਟਿਕੀ ਹੋਈ ਹੈ। ਔਰ ਗੁਆਂਢੀ ਮੁਲਕ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਚੱਲ ਰਹੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਟੈਰਿਫ ਨੇ ਉਹਦੇ ਕੀ ਪ੍ਰਭਾਵ ਪੈ ਸਕਦੇ ਆ। ਬੈਂਕ ਆਫ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਦੇ ਵਿਆਜ ਦਰ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਤਬਦੀਲੀਆਂ ਦੇ ਮਤਲਬ ਵੀ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਮਾਹਰ ਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਆਪੋ ਆਪਣੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਵਿਚਾਰ ਨੇ ਉਹ ਪ੍ਰਗਟਾਏ ਨੇ। ਖਾਸ ਤੌਰ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਕੁਝ ਆਪਣੇ ਫਾਈਨੈਂਸ਼ੀਅਲ ਇੰਸਟੀਟਿਊਟਸ ਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਨਜ਼ਰੀਏ ਨੇ ਉਹ ਵੀ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਆ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ। ਪਰ ਹਜੇ ਫਿਲਹਾਲ ਹੈ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਬੈਂਕ ਆਫ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਨੇ ਆਪਣੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਵਿਆਜ ਦਰ ਹੈ ਉਸ ਨੂੰ 2.75% ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਹੀ ਰੱਖਣ ਦੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਐਲਾਨਨਾਮੇ ਨੇ ਅੱਜ ਕਰ ਦਿੱਤੇ ਨੇ।
इसी के साथ हमें दीजिएगा इजाजत। खबरां दा लेखा जोखा के इस सेगमेंट से। Until next time, goodbye and be safe.